As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Adele Perry will be presenting History in the Water, Water Colonialism and Human Rights in 2023. So to give you Adele's background, Perry is a settler historian who grew up in British Columbia and has worked at the University of Manitoba since 2000. She works on histories of colonialism in northwestern North America in the 19th and 20th centuries and is committed to the transformative work of feminist and decolonizing scholarship. She is currently Distinguished Professor of History and Women's and Gender Studies and the Director of the Center for Human Rights Research. Adele, I will give you a verbal notification 5 minutes before the time for your talk is done. Welcome again, and thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm just going to share my slides here. Hopefully that all looks good. Adele Perry Nadishnikas, Gawin ni Dudimsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganash Kwe Ninda. My name's Adele Perry. I don't know my clan. I live in the city of Winnipeg, and I am a white settler woman and researcher in these particular contexts. So I very much have kind of enjoyed and benefited from being a part of this UNAIG group that has developed at the University of Manitoba. And what I wanted to do for my contribution to this Last Drop series is connect the long histories of colonialism and dispossession in the North American context to the ongoing crisis of water, in particular drinking water on reserves and on First Nations in Canada. And those of us who kind of out of it all sort of been kind of paying attention in any way or another over these last years know that this is an ongoing crisis, one that is in many respects seemingly intractable. The current federal government was elected first on a promise that they would end drinking water advisories or long-term drinking water advisories or boil water advisories on reserves within 5 years. That has been more than 5 years since then, and this has not happened. There has been drinking water advisories, long-term ones lifted since 2015, but there has been new ones introduced. And there has also been a complicated pattern that it's become clear that these problems have a kind of a seeming intractability. And what I want to suggest is that intractability tells us something about the character of Canadian colonialism and what it has meant and continues to mean for people living on reserve. And as drinking water advisories in some contexts are lifted, drinking water advisories in other contexts are introduced. And there is also an argument that was made, particularly by Martha Troyan, working for APTN, that there's a process that's ongoing that seems to suggest that there's also the introduction of short-term drinking water advisories where long-term ones formerly existed. So there is a changing landscape, certainly, that reflects changes in policy and practice from the federal government. But it is far from sort of the straightforward trajectory that they had promised, and that many people, I think, in the Canadian context might reasonably have expected. And I think that kind of ongoing context and that ongoing way, that this question of drinking water on reserves has become this kind of thorny issue tells us, I think, a great deal about the wider context of Canadian colonialism. And that's at least what I want to suggest. So a little bit about my ongoing work on these questions. I am principally a historian of the 18th and 19th centuries, really, that's my default setting. But I came to kind of working on these 20th century histories of settler colonialism in the Canadian context in a number of ways, and most particularly through these questions of water. In 2016, I wrote a short book, which you can sort of see on the slide here, called Aqueduct, Colonialism, Resources, and the Histories We Remember, which is an investigation of the city of Winnipeg and its history of drinking water and its relationship to settler colonialism, and in particular through the dispossession of the Anishinaabe community of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And I've continued to kind of work on that history in a range of ways, including publications in Kiera Ladner and Myra Tate's collection, Surviving Canada, and more recently as part of an edited collection dealing with the Royal Society and Indigenous Peoples. And I've also kind of continued to work on this through my work with the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. The center was established in 2012. I became the director in 2020. And at that point, really walked into a context where there was a long history of working on questions of the human right to water and also the Indigenous right to water, and the relationship between both food and water, and both human rights and Indigenous rights, and its relationship to both Canadian law, international human rights law, and treaty law. And so these are questions that continue to kind of inform the work we do at the center. And as part of that, in collaboration with this group that this talk is a part of, we are holding a Critical Conversations public seminar series, and that includes a talk coming up on February 28th that's dealing with water and borders, and it includes a number of scholars, including some folks who are involved in this group, including Carrie Miller and Nicole Wilson. And in part of that, one of the things I undertook was the writing of an expert report that was part of a major class action suit that had to do with drinking water on reserves that was led by Tatasqueat First Nation and also Curve Lake First Nation. And that was settled in 2021, last year. And for my kind of piece of that was to kind of offer a historical perspective where I essentially looked at the history of drinking water, domestic or potable water, and reserve systems in the Canadian context. And I kind of want to share a little bit of that work with you there to hopefully shed some light on ways that the current and the ongoing crises of drinking water on First Nations has taken the shape that it has. So here is a map that shows us Indian reserves in Canada in 1891. So at the critical kind of moment after some of the negotiations of the first of the numbered treaties, certainly before their completion and the way they moved to the west and to the north. But it gives us a sense of the development of a reserve system as kind of a crucial part of the development of kind of the architecture of Canadian colonialism, particularly taking kind of really significant shape in the 1880s. It drew on longstanding practices in both French and British and American colonialism. But these were kind of forms that took on a new meaning and a new kind of carceral power and authority following the creation of Canada as kind of a curious settler colonial project in 1867, and then more particularly following the passage of the Indian Act in 1876. And that kind of way that sort of reserves as a kind of a mechanism of kind of colonial authority and control take shape tells us a lot about the way that these systems develop in these contexts. Questions of access to drinking water on reserve were significant rights kind of from the outset. In other words, there is evidence throughout the archives left by administrators who worked either locally on reserves or in regional kind of headquarters or in the Ottawa context, that they were aware of poor water on reserves and were concerned with, in one way or another, addressing it, though never in sort of a systematic or kind of particularly robust sort of way, but in a way that kind of reflected an awareness of the extent to which First Nations reserves were developing a place within a kind of a modern Canadian context where access to good and clean drinking water became a real symbol of the extent of which the kind of the modern nation state, whether at a municipal or federal level or sometimes a provincial level, might deliver for particular communities. And so here we see a photograph of people hauling water associated with the Hay River Residential School in what's now the Northwest Territories. And you can get a little bit of a sense of sort of the technology here. Also its relationship to residential schooling and these histories of drinking water reserves and residential schooling cannot easily be kind of prized apart. They are very much tied together in important ways. And you also get a sense about the importance of child labor here. And this, of course, reflects something that is true for residential schooling as a whole, which is, of course, very much oriented around the organization and the kind of the compulsion of children and youth's labor. But it also tells us a little bit about the connections between this kind of work and what we can think about as some of the sort of systems of labor that shape human access to drinking water globally and continue to, which has to do with the importance in particular of women's and of children's labor. Here is another photograph. This is from a later time period of Whitefish Lake Residential School from 1942. And again, we can see the particular get a little bit of a sense about the way that the municipal water systems, which were by then defining kind of modern Canadian life for a great many people, particularly in urban contexts, including that of Winnipeg, were not available to people who lived on reserve or, in this case, in a residential school. This connection between reserves, First Nations, and poor drinking water was one that was made by people at the time. And I think one of the things that sometimes comes up when we discuss these sorts of historical problems, these contemporary problems in a historical context, is this kind of idea that these were issues that just passed people by at the time, that it was normal, that they didn't know anything better. And this is a cartoon here that reminds us of some of the ways that we can see that people at the time that these issues were occurring were aware of their connections. We can see how these histories were not always naturalized and constructed as inevitable, but were called out by particular people in ways that remind us that history could have turned out otherwise. And this in particular is a cartoon from 1978 produced by Everett Soup, the kind of legendary Kainai journalist and critic, where he makes connections between sort of the government, the medical system, and reserve water. And we can see here the way that poor drinking water on reserve is being alerted to in this context, that it is not something that became an issue in the 21st century, but it was something of longer duration, and also something that Indigenous people and Indigenous critics drew attention to. I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I'm just going to quickly call up a file here. If you can pardon my little technical glitch here, and just bear with me. I am going to just quickly drag something up. So I think what we sort of see here is how the contemporary kind of context, where the ongoing and seemingly kind of intractable character of the problem of bad drinking water on reserves has its lineage in kind of much longer histories, and in structures that were developed not simply in the years preceding the moment where First Nations were put under drinking water advisories, but were developed as crucial parts of the sort of development of a structure of Canadian settler colonialism that in particular developed in the years following the end of the 19th century, that it was the development of the reserve system, the development of residential schooling, the development of a particular kind of carceral practice of settler colonialism exerted over Indigenous peoples that produced the context by which suddenly in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Indigenous peoples and particular First Nations on reserve were found to be suddenly noticed to be by a non-Indigenous public lacking the kind of things, the kind of resources, and in this case, clean water, that non-Indigenous people, particularly city dwellers, such as myself and my family, had long taken for granted. And what I want to suggest is that these histories are embedded in long histories. Current crises on reserve drinking water have been really a long time coming. The roots of today's enduring problems lay in centuries of colonialism, and in particular, the century and a half of federal state policy that has developed since 1867. The impact of a system of federal control on reserves and services on them is made clear by the experiences of two small Ontario communities that each experienced a drinking water crisis in the year 2000. A historian named Laurie Chambers has examined what happened when the water systems failed in the southern settler town of Walkerton and in the northern Anishinaabe community of Pikangikum in the province's north. Waterton's drinking crisis received a great deal of attention, including from Ontario's premier, and ultimately a provincial inquiry. It also resulted in some very tangible changes to the province's regulatory framework. The failure of Pikangikum's water supply in 2000 attracted much less attention and produced no clear policy changes. These differences reflected Pikangikum's poverty, the indifference of a Canadian public, and the fact, as Chambers explained, that the Indian Act, and I quote here, ensured that First Nations communities do not have full and independent control over their finances. Here, as elsewhere, First Nations, in the words of Sherry Pasternak, are forced to, and I quote again, answer for a poverty that the state itself produced. While members of the First Nations dealt with third-party management and the continued lack of adequate water, power, and sewage, the federal government operated a small-scale water treatment plant in Pikangikum for the largely non-Indigenous federal employees there. Compelled by labor law, Health Canada installed water treatment units in 20 on-reserve nursing clinics across Canada in 2002 alone. Legal scholar Constance McIntosh notes that all populations under federal jurisdiction have their water protected by law, except for on-reserve First Nations people. Stories of inadequate water and impossible governance are not, of course, the only stories that need to be told about reserves. As Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burrows explains, critical analysis of the reserve systems and what it creates must also recognize, and I quote here, how a great many Indigenous peoples feel about their reserves and larger traditional territories. They love them, Burrows explains. They would die for them. Many do die for them. Reserves are, and I quote, a wellspring of family life, of language, culture, sustenance, tradition, social belonging, and meaning for many Indigenous people. This is a love that is sustained in the face of great difficulties, ones that are rooted in history. The reserve system has its origins in French and British colonies, but took form in the years following Confederation and the passage of the Indian Act. Reserves began small and they became smaller and very often poorer. Sometimes they were relocated. The British North America Act that made Canada responsible for reserves and for the services that either occurred or did not occur there. This would include drinking water and the infrastructure necessary for it. Changes that appeared to give First Nations greater control over reserves often work to make them responsible for infrastructure and services that they could not and cannot afford, and simultaneously denied them the capacity to alter these circumstances. The crisis in drinking water and reserves that we are currently in and continue to be in, and that has been recognized more and more in the past decades, has its roots in these histories and in these policies. And a discussion of human rights, Indigenous rights, and water in the present has to begin with an exploration of those histories. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.